Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of the Survey Research Methods. Tonight we're going to talk about how to conduct a survey. We're going to go through steps that you will take to plan and conduct a survey and to help ensure that you get all the data that you need to collect. Now we're going to go through a lot of specific steps. We're going to start with 10 of them. Each one of them will give a little overview of it, and then in the coming weeks of the course you'll get, of course, more of the details about each one of those steps. So how to conduct a survey? Well, I've outlined 10 steps for planning and conducting a survey research project. The first one is define the purpose of the study. I've been involved in many studies over the years where the sponsoring organization didn't do all their homework up front and really think carefully through what it was they wanted to accomplish. And this, of course, is just like with any research project, the natural first step. The second thing you have to do is identify the population you want to study. Who do you want your conclusions to apply to? Who do you want to make generalizations about from your sample back to the population? The next step is outlining all the data you need to collect. What is it that you think you need to meet your purpose? And then you want to select the appropriate data collection methods. It's very popular now today to just default to online surveys. And they're cheap and they're easy. But there's some considerations in deciding whether you go with the modern day default or not. And there's still places for face-to-face interviews and other types of methods. So we'll talk briefly about that. And then, of course, you develop the questionnaire. You need to pilot the questionnaire. So we're going to talk a little bit about pilot studies and then more about pilot studies as the semester goes on. You need to create an administrative plan, and an administrative plan basically outlines all the practical steps that need to be taken and who on your team is going to be responsible for each one. And then you have to develop a sampling plan and implement that sampling plan. And then, of course, the final steps are collect the data and analyze the data and report the results. So let's go to the first step. Define the purpose of the study. Well, as is kind of obvious, I guess you need to develop a very well thought out written purpose statement for the study. What is your mission in a sense? What are you trying to accomplish? Why are you doing the study? And then you want to define specific measurable objectives in clear and concise terms. So, for example, I want to collect data that will tell me what percentage of voters would vote for a particular candidate if the election were held today. That's an example of a very specific measurable objective in clear and concise terms. You also want to develop research questions, so survey research projects are no different than other types of research studies. So you want to have hypotheses, research questions, and you want to have a good sense of theoretical contingencies that are rooted in the existing theory and knowledge base in the field. What does this mean? It's a lot of words. Well, what it means is, if my results come out this way, I know how to interpret it. If they come out that way, I know how to interpret it. I've already kind of got a sense of what the meaning of the results might be, depending on which way they go. I know how to interpret the findings. Next step, identifying the population to be studied. So you want to set some goals for yourself in terms of generalizability. When I'm at the end of my study and I made my interpretations, from my sample data, what population do I want those conclusions to generalize to? So this requires you to then, of course, think about membership in the population. Who's in and who's out? Are there any key characteristics that everyone in the population shares so you can come up with a strategy for screening out who's properly qualified and not qualified to be in the study? And this sometimes means that you have to include screening questions at the beginning of the survey. So a simple example would be, I want to study all classroom teachers currently working in Cabarrus County schools. You would get the best available sampling frame from that school system, meaning, say, all the email addresses of current classroom teachers. But you might want to investigate a little bit about how accurate, how up-to-date, how limited is that sampling frame. Sampling frame, again, being the best possible list of all the members of the population. Well, a simple way to include a screening question at the beginning of the survey might be to start right up front and ask, are you currently serving as a classroom teacher in Cabarrus County? Now, you might think it's kind of obvious, but if the answer is yes, they continue. If the answer is no, you thank them for their participation and you move on. Well, you might say, well, why is that kind of thing even necessary? And again, this is a very simple example, but it's necessary because the best available sampling frame or best available list of the members of the population that you obtain may not be completely up to date. So in that example, perhaps someone's been promoted to become an assistant principal, or someone has retired, or someone's on medical leave, and so forth. Next, you want to outline the data to be collected. So now is when you create what's called a crosswalk, and a crosswalk is similar to a construct map in measurement or test development. So let's talk first about what is a construct map. Well, construct map is where you identify all the key behaviors or attributes or attitudes, whatever it might be, that are involved in the construct, and then you identify what types of items you need to assess that element of the construct, and then you identify the actual item content. So you kind of make a table for yourself. Well, the same, and with achievement tests, it would be you identify every instructional objective for the course, say, if it was like an end of course or end of grade test, and you identify every type of indicator that that instructional objective has been met. And then in the third column, you would have the particular item content that you have to develop in order to assess whether proficiency or competence or whatever it might be has been achieved for that particular instructional objective. Well, crosswalk is very similar. So what you do with a crosswalk in a survey research context is you create a plan that aligns each research objective with what kind of data you need to collect, and then what's the method for collecting each one of those data points. So that's the survey questions. And you also want to include on your crosswalk any additional variables you need for subgroup comparisons or classifications. So this is things like demographic variables, years of experience, attributes of your respondents, etc. Okay, next, select the appropriate data collection method. Well, here you determine if any variables on the crosswalk are available through existing databases. This might seem like an odd concept to start with, but sometimes you unnecessarily will lengthen a survey by asking people to report about data that you can get from other sources. And if you can get it from other sources, it lowers the length of the survey and therefore probably enhances response rate because you'll lose fewer people. But furthermore, sometimes asking people to remember something that you can get in a database is introducing the possibility that you're going to be getting a less reliable source for that data. So for example, if you were going to survey teachers all across a district, you were going to ask them, tell me which school you teach in, and then you were going to ask them, is your school a Title I school, or what is the percentage of free or reduced lunch eligible children in your school? Well, that data, once you know the school, you can get the data about those characteristics from much more reliable government databases, federal and state and district databases. That's kind of maybe a silly example that you wouldn't actually use, but it's the same idea, right? You want to think about, am I asking things that I can get better from other sources, and so I can maybe shorten the survey and therefore enhance the probability that I get a better response rate. The next step is to evaluate the appropriateness and feasibility of the different methods. What are the different methods? Well, good old mail surveys, not used very much anymore, but they still have their place, or paper and pencil surveys, phone, face-to-face, or online data collection. Again, the default now is online, and for good reason in some ways, right? Because it's very cheap. It doesn't cost you anything more to send a survey to the entire population, or at least the best sampling frame you can get to represent that population, as it does to send to a sample. So why wouldn't you just send to 1,000 when it doesn't cost any more to send to 1,000 than it would to send to 150 as a sample? However, having said that, I'll give you an example of a study that we conducted in our center where we used paper and pencil, and it was marvelously effective when we got almost complete response rate, 100%. The scenario was this. We were doing, as is true to my research interests, we were doing a study on teacher stress in the local school system. Well, the school system at that time was willing to give us access to staff meetings, or, building level staff meetings at every school in the district. So we thought to ourselves, well, if we can go there and pitch our study, why not just pass out paper copies and get them to return them right there, and they can physically see us take them back to UNC Charlotte, so that there's, in some ways, I think part of the reason we got such a high response rate with that study was because we collected it on the spot. People didn't have to remember to do it, set aside any other time. But also, they probably had a keener sense of anonymity and confidentiality because we were taking them with us physically to another place. It was not like they felt like there was much risk that their principal was going to somehow find out what they said about the working conditions in their school. Face-to-face interviews still have their place. Zoom interviews still have their place. They're very important strategies for collecting important information. And what we like to do, and I think is really good practice, is start with qualitative interviewing, then conduct a survey, and then do a follow-up round of qualitative interviewing. So you might ask, why? What is the value of that sort of mixing of methods? Well, the value is this. The upfront qualitative work is very important to getting the wording of the survey correct, right? It's foolish to go out into full-blown data collection without having first thought through how to word your items, how do the members of the population talk about or describe or explain the phenomenon you're most interested in. So upfront qualitative work can really help you find the voice of the respondents, so to speak. Then the quantitative work, of course, is the collecting of closed-ended survey items. But even then, there's often qualitative work involved because we often, and rightfully, ask open-ended questions, free response questions, if you will, within surveys. So then the respondents have a chance to enter in their own perceptions, and then you have to go through a qualitative coding process to establish codes and themes and elements and so forth of that qualitative data. And then the final phase of qualitative is often like validation or interpretation enhancing follow-up interviews. Surveys can be wonderful to give you sort of a snapshot, cross-sectional snapshot in time of how a particular population feels about an issue, but interviews then following up on those, especially when you construct the interview protocol based on the data that you found out in the survey phase, can really help you understand a richer, more nuanced picture of why people think the way they do, because you can ask probing questions, follow-up questions, etc. So you want to think through what kind of survey data collection method is best. And often that means there's a need for mixed modes, quantitative and qualitative, face-to-face and online, etc. Okay, then of course the obvious, developing the questionnaire, but as you can see, it's not the first step, right? You don't just jump right to doing that. So of course you want to take your crosswalk and, research objectives, data needed, items to collect the information that's needed, and you want to use that as your sort of blueprint for how you develop the questionnaire. You want to consider whether there are existing measures that have already been developed, maybe even tested and validated so they have reasonable reliability, validity, maybe even cultural sensitivity, if you will. So you want to consider if there's existing measures, scales, and surveys that can do the job for you and relieve you of the burden of making up something new that may not turn out to be as good as an existing measure. So oftentimes, large survey studies that have incentives, therefore they can feel justified in asking the respondents to answer a long range of questions, will string together a series of existing scales or measures or surveys, and then add some additional questions to those. But in general, as a general principle, you want to keep the survey simple, brief, and very specific. Things that are too complicated, things that are too lengthy, things that are too general tend to get, or elicit, if you will, less reliable information from your respondents. Obviously, you want to avoid leading or biased content in your questions. We're going to get more into this as the semester goes on. You want to be careful not to overburden the respondents because you want to keep them engaged with the process to the end, and you want to keep them, motivated to finish the survey. And that means not making it too long so they wear out and quit on you, and so forth. Now, a pet peeve of mine, and something that I emphasize a lot, is pay very close attention to the ordering of the questions. What I mean by this is, it's often common to see people start with demographics. I think you put demographics at the end. Remember, you've just assured someone that the information they're providing will be confidential and anonymous. And then the first thing you ask them is, what grade level do you teach? What's your gender? What's your ethnicity or race, etc.? Well, if you're the only white male kindergarten teacher in your school, you've just identified yourself, right? So that's not the way to start. Generally, the best recommendations are to start with the easiest questions to answer, the questions that pique the interest of the potential respondents and draw them in, and then you gradually work towards the more sensitive questions so that by the time they get the most sensitive questions, they're already committed, they're already in, they've already gone through a fair amount of effort to reach a pretty good amount of progress towards the end of the survey. And then you follow that with demographic questions, and at the end, before you present the demographic questions to the respondent, you say, I'm reminding you that this information will not be used to identify you in any way. We assure you of your confidentiality and anonymity, and these questions are here just for classification purposes, so we might be able to compare some subgroups to enhance our interpretation of the results. Next thing, the pilot study. So the general advice about pilot studies is to pilot with 3 groups of stakeholders, and you have to think about who are the stakeholders of your study. Who has a stake in the findings of the study might use them. So the first group you want to work with is research methodology experts. There may be people who have gained a lot of experience in surveying or doing research projects with the exact population that you're interested in studying. You might also want to run it by survey research methodology people who have been involved in a lot of surveys, because there are general principles of good survey design that may transcend content or target population or just good practices. The second group you want to identify as a stakeholder is who is the target audience for the results. If you're doing the study for a group of policymakers and they really think the information is going to be important in informing some policy discussion, you want them to review it to make sure they feel comfortable that the way the survey is constructed and the way the items are written will give them the information they need to inform the decisions they're focusing on. So you want to think about who's the audience for the results, who's going to get the final report, and make sure they have a chance to give their input into the construction of the survey. And then finally, the obvious answer is the potential respondents from the population, right? And generally you can do fine with a pilot study with, between half a dozen and a dozen potential respondents. So what do you do when you conduct a pilot study? Well, the first thing is you want to define for the people taking the survey as a pilot for you. What's your purpose? So they know what it is that you're trying to do. You want to ask them after they've completed the survey, how long did it take to take the questionnaire? And it's important. You may not be able to fully and accurately estimate how long it's going to take people. So you want to know. And that's important because without incentives, you can probably hold people's attention for 10, 15, 20 minutes maybe. With incentives, if you're paying them to do it, you can probably maybe go up to 30, 35, 40 minutes to take a survey because, even just a $5 gift card acknowledges a person's effort and people want to finish and get the gift card. But you want to know how long it takes the typical respondent to answer. So you need to figure out if you can afford to add a few questions or do you need to shrink it back some. And again, that depends on your circumstances, whether you're offering incentives or not, or what the conditions are for the respondents filling in the survey. You want to ask them some additional questions after they've completed the survey about their understanding of the content, the clarity, any ambiguity issues. In other words, did they find the items clear? Did they find the content understandable? Was there anything that was confusing? Because this can give you valuable feedback on items that may need to be revised. You want to also ask them about use of terminology. This is to check and verify that you worded your questions in a way that accounts for the voice of the population. So you want to ask them, did we use the terms you would use to describe the different phenomena that we're talking about? And then you want to ask what is missing. Is there something you wanted to share with us about this general topic that we didn't ask about? And that's also very valuable feedback sometimes. There are specific strategies like cognitive interviewing and some modified focus group strategies that can also be very, very helpful. When I've done this, what I've often done is had a small group of folks. They take the survey independently, maybe on paper or on a screen, and then we bring them together and we do a talk aloud method. We go through question one by one and we say, what did you think we were asking? How do you react to the way we asked it? Any suggestions about the wording? Anything you found ambiguous or confusing? Okay, administrative plan. Well, what is this about? Well, you have to identify all the tasks that have to be completed to complete the survey project. And they're more involved than you might think. And then you want to identify a person who's responsible for each task, and you want to put it all in the context of a timeline. Part of the timeline is about, when we're going to open up the survey, when we're going to close it, maybe when we're going to send follow-up reminders. I always like to say, send a pre-notification, send an invitation, and then send follow-up reminders. And you might want to have different people monitoring each one of those tasks. You might want to have somebody who's, if you're using Qualtrics, say, who's your point person on Qualtrics. Someone might be responsible for dealing with the sampling plan, getting the best available list from the population, etc. So there's a lot of administrative tasks that have to go on to get a study executed properly. And they can vary a little bit by the content and the population you're focusing on. And then, of course, you need to go through IRB application and approval process. And, of course, you want to assure your respondents regarding issues like confidentiality and anonymity. You want to include a statement of informed consent, just like any good IRB would require you to do. And you want to address any additional ethical issues that are unique to your study. So this means, as I was mentioning before, you have a plan for pre-notification. You have a strategy for sending out an initial email to say, this is important, this is why we're doing this is who we are, you've been selected to represent people like you, we really hope you participate, so be watching for our survey invitation. And then you send out the next email, will be to actually follow this link to the survey. You want to address incentives, including how they will be distributed. And this gets a little trickier than you might think, because you're telling people on one hand their information will be kept confidential and anonymous, yet if you have incentives to give, you have to give them the incentive, right? So what we usually do is we work with a company called Tango. What Tango does is they send an electronic gift card to people who have completed the survey for you. They take care of it. You just deposit money into the account and they send them out. And all you do is send them the email addresses, and you can have someone on your team separating the email addresses of the completers from the survey data itself, so the people that analyze the data don't see the, from whom each piece of data came. So this involves, of course, plans for any kind of personally identifiable data or information. You need to be able to identify respondents if you need to for something like incentives or follow-up reminders, but then you also need to de-identify the data before you analyze it. So these are all important considerations in developing your plan, who's going to do what. And then you develop and implement the best sampling plan. Well, the first step in doing that is accessing the most up-to-date sampling frame. And remember, we said sampling frame is the best available list of the members of the population. Once you have that, then you need to go through a systematic process of looking at whether there are duplicates in that sampling frame, because that happens. Or if they have a plan for figuring out if there are any unqualified cases, people that are on the list but really don't belong to the population. You also need to think about the information you need in order to calculate sample size calculations or statistical power calculations, because they inform how many respondents you need to end up with at the end of the study. So what are some of the things you need to do that? And we're going to get into the specifics of these calculations later in the semester. You need to know how variable are the responses. So for maybe some of your most important items, does everybody pretty much have the same opinion, or opinions vary quite widely? You need to estimate what you think your expected response rate is going to be. You might say, well, why do I need to do that? Well, if you want to end up with 100 respondents and your population has a history of a 50% response rate, then of course you need to send out 200 or sample 200 and send out to 200. You need to think about, are there any important or salient subgroups or strata, what we call strata in survey research? And then you need to think about these response rate and variability issues specific to the strata. Are there subgroups in your population that are less likely to respond than the general population is? Are there subgroups in your population where there's a lot of homogeneity of opinion, and then other subgroups where there's a lot of variability in opinion? And all these factors come into play in how you calculate the sample size you need. And we'll look at that in greater detail as the semester goes on. And then you have to just select the most important sampling method. So as we go on in the semester, we're going to learn about, and it'll be review in some cases, what is simple random sampling? What are the advantages and disadvantages? How do you do it? Same for stratified random sampling, cluster sampling, linear systematic sampling, and multi-stage sampling. All these things have their, like I said, advantages and disadvantages and their places in research design. So we'll talk through some of that. But one of your decision points is, which sampling strategy am I going to use? And again, this is if you're going to do sampling. Sometimes, especially with smaller organizations, you might just send to the entire population. But just because it's easy to send to the entire population, you're going to hear me say this a lot this semester, does not mean that there's no place for sampling. Sometimes sampling can actually get you a better result. Okay, so we talked about getting ready to do sample size calculations by creating a certain, sort of picture of some of the key pieces of information you need for those calculations. But then you have to do them. You have to calculate the sample size needed to achieve a desired precision, meaning like margin of error, plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 4%, whatever it might be, or a specific desired statistical power. Like if you have some very particular group comparisons you want to make, then you want to see what sample size do I need in each group to ensure that I have a reasonable ability to detect a statistically significant difference if there is one. So of course all this comes down to, though, in the end, do you want to contact the entire population, or do you want to use some kind of valid randomizing device and sampling strategy to select a sample? And we'll get into more of the details of which might be better and what are the advantages and disadvantages of both. And then, of course, collecting the data. As you do so, you want to monitor response rate throughout the data collection period. You want to see how it's going. You want to also monitor bounce backs or invalid email addresses or whatever they might be, returns. Because if you get a lot of them, if you get a few, maybe you don't do anything about it if they're just kind of random. But if you get a lot of them, you might need to be taking steps to make sure that you do get people for whom you do not have the accurate address. You get the right information so you can contact them, so you know you're inviting, a truly representative sample, or inviting the entire population. You also want to monitor the responses to the screening questions, because you can see in the data how many people get bounced out and don't complete the survey, and that'll give you another sense of how accurate the sampling frame is. Then you want to monitor completion rate from among those who start the survey, right? In other words, you might get people who start, they respond, they start, but they don't go all the way to the end. And so if that gets too high, that might give you some information about maybe we made something too sensitive or too hard or too long. And you can look at where did people tend to drop out. And if it's right around the same question, that might kind of give you a clue about something that may need to be revised in a future study. You can even adjust the data collection process or the schedule as needed. If you're getting a lot of problems, maybe you keep the survey open for longer and send people another communication about that. Then analyzing the data, there's some basic things we always do in survey research. We compare the respondent characteristics to the characteristics that we know about in the population. This helps us understand, did we have a representative sample or not? So what we're basically doing is we're evaluating whether there was any non-response bias or any coverage error issues. Non-response bias means some groups responded in higher rates than other groups did, so you've overrepresented some groups and underrepresented other groups, and so you might result in biased results. Coverage error is where your sampling frame wasn't so good, and maybe you got a lot of bounce backs from some segment of the population, and so the bias was not related to people's decisions to participate, it was related to the inaccuracies in your sampling frame. Your sampling frame did not cover the entire population, so to speak. Now, these kind of problems can be dealt with weighting, and we're going to talk later in the semester about what weighting means, but weighting means you might take one subgroup that was slightly underrepresented and bump them up a little bit in weight, and another group that was overrepresented, you might count their information as a little bit lower weighted so that you can kind of even out these potential biases and get a more representative result. And then you always want to calculate and report response rate. It's important for readers to know what response rate did you get. And you also want to include confidence intervals and a margin of error or precision level as information for your reader. You want to think about developing scale scores, composite scores, because sometimes they can be more stable and powerful pieces of information. And that's not unlike doing that in any kind of measurement test. So you would do the same kinds of things. It might be factor analysis or reliability checks or whatever it might be. You want to try to compare your results to the results of previous studies that sampled from the same population. This gives you a sense of validity, but it also can give you a sense of whether anything in the population has changed. You want to compare your results to normative information if that's available. So, for example, remember we talked about sometimes you would embed an existing instrument into your survey. Well, maybe that existing instrument has norms. And you can say, X% of people in this group are expected to score a certain way. And then you say, well, did my sample score that way or not? And what does that mean? And then you want to address all planned subgroup comparisons. So this is usually where you break out your responses by important demographic variables. So let's wrap this up then. These steps, what do they tell us? Well, as we've talked about before, surveys can yield meaningful information. They're only one type of data collection strategy, and they're giving you self-report data. But self-report data can be useful and it can be valuable if the things that you're interested in studying can be best accessed through self-report. So you have to remember that survey research methods are excellent and useful when the types of questions you're asking fit with the methods of survey research. And then finally, of course, asking the wrong questions or including poorly designed questions in your survey, these things can impact the validity of your results. And that's why you want to be very careful and planful as you construct it. And finally, sampling error, response bias, non-response bias, and measurement error, they're nearly always present in a study. Your goal is not to eliminate them because you can't eliminate them. Your goal is to minimize them as much as possible by being very careful and deliberate in how you plan and execute the study. Okay, well, we'll pick it up there next week.